So returning to the 4th chapter of St. John, we have the development of this discourse with the Samaritan woman and the notion of something that regards us is handled. It's what true worship is about. As we know, the Samaritan woman associated with a place, and the Lord transposes it to something quite different, of a different order. Now, we need to have a clear vision as to what true worship is about, because our life is a life of liturgy. Our whole life is a life of praise, an act of praise, and much of our time is spent directly glorifying the Father. Therefore, placing into activity that virtue of religio, which binds us, religare, to God, and something which we need to be aware of as the fundamental relationship of a creature, but in particular a consecrated creature, to his King and Maker, that we need to be worshipping well. Sincerity. Now, the Lord develops it in this way. Believe me, woman, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation comes from the Jews. And here we have this crucial verse, but the hour is coming, indeed is already here, when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. That is the kind of worshipper the Father seeks. God is spirit, and those who worship must worship in spirit and truth. If one looks around the Christian horizon, one observes different approaches to the act of worship. In Holland, as in Britain, one cannot but be aware of the large number of brethren who worship God, starting from different standpoints, different premises. But it actually can be positive for us and not negative. We have noticed in England specifically that in the last period we have been challenged by the quality of worship coming in from the Anglican Communion. We have a large number of priests coming in to the Catholic Church and being ordained, and also a number of people. But they are coming with their sincerity of praise and worship, and also a high standard of preaching. That, in recent times, has quite radically changed since I was growing up. The ethos of an average parish, where it was very much influenced by what was coming from Ireland, because basically much of the church would have been in Wales where I was living, Irish people or the descendants of them in exile, often with their own priest. So it was a bit of Ireland in Britain, and therefore the challenge was not there. It was a self-contained unit. Now we have been obliged to sit up and pay attention, and it is a good thing. You too are in a similar situation, that you are challenged by, I would presume, high qualities of singing, preaching and prayer. The only thing is, of course, that it is not based on the fullness of truth. God, of course, is present in this worship and is accepting it. His grace comes through this limitedness, because God is on side. God helps his creatures there where they're at. But his positive will, not his permissive will, but his positive will was a fullness of truth. And therefore all goodwill and genuine seeking, as in the case of Newman, comes towards the centre. Now, this question of the fullness of truth is linked with worship. Unfortunately, we are witnessing in our time an erosion on the level of the transmission of truth. And that, of course, is having its effect on an erosion also on some elements, at least, of our worship. In practice, in concrete terms, if the growing generations are not fully aware of what actually is happening at the altar, then consequences follow. What is unfortunately happening also in some situations is that this other side of what Protestants actually believe is coming in also and influencing us in a negative way. That in a false ecumenism, we are by osmosis being influenced also by doctrine. Now we need to be aware of that danger because it's not just human. We know that satanic forces are at work and that the devil has a perfect hatred for the presence and attacks God in it, making use of people of weak faith. Now, just for us to be aware of that in this particular place where the whole of the thrust is towards making reparation and genuine adoration in this place, perpetual adoration, it is good to be aware that that is, as priests, also at the centre of our life, and must be so. We are Eucharistically orientated and fundamentally so. It is the centre of our very being. And though we cannot always be in church because of the nature of the ministry, at least of people in active life, the magnet is there. And the central point of gravity is the tabernacle and the host. So homeward bound, coming home where the angels are, and we are bathed in an atmosphere of sacrality and angelic presence when we are anywhere where the Blessed Sacrament is, and our guardian angel is happy to be there. He knows straight away and sees his other brethren there in adoration. That is home, at the foot of the altar. So, essentially, anything which is an expression of that has to be a natural outflowing of what is there. And if that is not there, then of course things on the outflowing of it will not be there either. So if we look around at the situation often where we find gross disobedience and abuse coming in, it is the symptom of this other problem. Therefore the problem is at that level. If there is a genuine relationship, then obedience will automatically follow. One cannot please in worship the person that one is worshipping and at the same time being disobedient to his expressed will. It is incoherent. We are then in some way taking his place. And that is something satanic. I am the centre of attention, non serviam. There's a humility in worship where we accept the will of God interpreted. For us, it is quite easy, especially now when there has been much simplification. Just obeying the will of God as expressed by what is written in the liturgical books. There's a great latitude within them, but within those parameters we should not be disobedient if we want the Lord's blessing. He's not free to bless what is not honouring him. Now, I noticed at the wonderful celebration that we just had now that it was genuinely that. One was not thinking about anything but God. We were bathed in an atmosphere of otherness. It just happened, following calmly. Strangely enough, actually, from different countries, what we know to be correct. It's interesting that wherever one goes in the Catholic Church, one is at home and celebrates at any altar, it's the same. And also, I did notice that the wonderful bishop that you have here, as well as preaching quite strongly, actually, on both the danger of losing our soul. He did mention hell by bad influences, but also on satanic principles, that Satan is the centre and that he likes us to be the same. I am satisfied. That was interesting coming from a young bishop. But I noticed also that when it came to the receiving of the Lord's body and blood, he was there. And I came just because there was something practical just to give him his spectacles. I noticed he was deeply enwrapped in prayer. Now that was very edifying. That is worship in spirit and in truth. And that's what the people pick up. That is very simple, but it's there potentially in the rubrics. That space after Holy Communion, it is to be put in evidence, and there are ways and means of doing it. We have a great blessing in our time with the new spring which has come through Taizé. That a great plethora of simple repetitive chants like mantras have gone around the Catholic world and even actually the Protestant world, and they are there for the taking. One can sustain an atmosphere with closed eyes just by intoning a simple Taizé chant at that point. And it's something which actually gives glory to God and healing to man. It sustains a silence without the silence being embarrassing. So they're great simple tricks which work for our healing and the honouring and giving space to that majesty which surrounds us, and at that point is in our midst. Now, the awareness of satanic forces, of the truth of the Catholic Church, is something that we need to be aware of. They are very interested, these demonic forces, in the Church, because they know better than we do that the fullness is there. And therefore in history we find that constantly there is an attack after an attack, using weak channels. When I was in Rome, I was told by a friend of mine who actually had received the Premonstratensian succession as a novice in secret in the communist regime. It was done in secret and so on. But he was about my age and he knew a lot, and he knew all about Rome, and he knew all the details. And one time he told me there are two altars close to each other. One is the altar where St. Maximiliano Kolbe celebrated his first Mass, and the other is the altar at which Martin Luther celebrated his last. And actually I celebrated after ordination on the first of those two altars, and it's very moving. Our Lady had appeared there before. But the thought that one thinks at such points are these: this unchanging grace that comes through the centuries to each newly ordained priest can take him this way or that way. The devil hates the priesthood and is always tugging and attacking, and he's succeeding, unfortunately, in many cases, precisely because the barrage of which we have been speaking, that element of constant return, therefore that being exposed to God protects us, that we're working from that invisible dynamic, not just human functioning and administration. Well, in the case of Luther, we have in his early works beautiful passages about Our Lady and so on. And then, of course, he had lights about abuses, but something happened at a certain point. He had a following, and this self-sufficiency came in, and the tone becomes bitter, independent, and let's say it, proud. Now this is something unfortunate, because all this that pertains to destroying the church in some way participates in that pride. The church is not human. It is the bride of Christ. And to do anything to disrupt its harmony is in some way participating in the game of the enemy. And there are many, many people, unfortunately many in the ranks of the clergy, who, without being aware of it, are doing something of that nature, destroying unity. People are confused. They need the consolation of structure. They know in their heart of hearts where the truth is. And this element of wanting to be original, to fabricate, but in disobedience, it's bound in the long run, after initial success, to lead to a withdrawal of divine blessing. And then people ask, why are people not coming forward for ordination? Why are people not coming to church? Well, the Lord again will bless freely where he is directly obeyed. We notice that in communities, even this community, we see that it is healthy. The Lord is blessing it with lovely young vocations. Why? He is the centre. There is genuine obedience to his will. He's free to bless. He's not free to bless somewhere where they're going to be badly formed. What's the point? So in that case, we can be also channels of light for young people. There are vocations out there. John Bosco, St. John Bosco, was aware that there was a high proportion of vocations which never took fruit. He could see mystically that there were 1 in 3 of his boys who were called, but only some would actually come forward. But potentially grace was like nature, very generous. So we can be the calling instrument for God. At a young age, grace is already working at a child. I was talking just the other day to somebody who is in the parish of a college friend of mine. We were together in Rome. He's now in one of the next churches to me. And I use his church, the only public mass I have on his Sunday and feast days. I have the use of his altar because people have asked me to celebrate a Latin mass on that day. And they come from all over the place. But he is very orthodox, very faithful. He gives the fullness of teaching to the 5 schools that he has in his care and in the pulpit. He's clear, reverent, and kind as well. And I picked up that in the short time that he is there, little people in the schools are already starting to talk about the priesthood and wanting to come forward. Children are uncontaminated and they respond to the messages that have always worked. They are fascinated by the sacred. My friend is actually a good image of somebody who is dignified but kind. That's important for children. Goodness attracts. Therefore, when these eventual possibilities come along, it's important that we be aware, that we know exactly where to orientate them, because many good vocations are lost from being put to a place where they will not be encouraged in the right way. Unfortunately, some of the best are lost by being aggressed. We know what happens in some places. So it's a delicate issue nowadays. We have had in Ireland this apostolic visitation from the Vatican a while back, and they were going into this very carefully, what's going on in the institutions of formation. So they're trying to readjust things, but it's not right that good vocations should be in some way sifted out, because they're too much keen on things like the rosary and that kind of thing. One wonders where that is coming from. So anyway, we noticed in Rome, of all the colleges there, the most faithful, it would seem, was the biggest of all, the North American College. A lot of Eucharistic adoration, very severe on some things. When I was there, anyway, they always had the clerical things. It was very, very orthodox, faithful to the Pope, very, very close to the Vatican. But that was interesting. Whereas the North American College in the 60s and 70s was avant-garde, it turned completely around. It became very faithful on every level, and it was always full of the best students. A great place to pray, and very good liturgy. That was the stream of good vocations going back to the States now. So God is free to bless where he is correctly honoured. But the other side of it is this, that because the satanic forces know full well what the real presence is, what the mystical body is, it will hit hard there, the Catholic Church perhaps more than any other. And it has been picked up in exorcism. I found this out quite by chance some years ago through a contemplative nun, a Benedictine nun, who had somebody who, although they themselves didn't have internet, this person, a friend of the community, did. And this other lady had found out through internet what had been picked up on fairly recent exorcisms, that the devil, or devils, under pressure were being obliged to make certain admissions. And in one very strong series of exorcisms, quite strongly and in some detail that the greatest friends, collaborators of the demonic forces in our time are actually priests themselves, those priests who give the wrong message, because they have a huge influence on the people. It can be in print, it can be in preaching, it can actually be in retreat work, because they're exposed there. Nuns and people like that come to retreats and they're given very incomplete messages, which then have a huge effect, because these nuns have influence too, and they carry them with them. So confusion comes in. The devil loves confusion. So just to be aware that all new things are not necessarily of the best origin. And without being in any way fixated, one needs to know exactly what's going on and to have discernment, which leads me to where I want to finish. This question of being able to discern the spirits. It's a gift of the Holy Spirit, and we need it as clergy, as priests, as friends of souls. We need to suss out, to be able to pick up what is going on and why, because spiritual illnesses are complex, and we need to know in our diagnosis what is actually on a deep level wrong, not just handle the symptoms and handle them without going further. Now, in the book of Proverbs, in chapter 8, we have this passage here about this element of being able to see what's going on. In chapter 8, verse 12, we have this verse, I, wisdom, share house with discretion. Discernere, kind of distinguishes, disperses, makes separation. I am mistress of the art of thought. Now, listening involves allowing, first of all, the truth to come out, so we learn. But then we have our own reactions to what we're picking up. We're all the time filtering. And we're all the time preparing our response, even when listening. Well, that can happen too much sometimes. When we're actually initially listening, that operation of forming the response, it's better to let it wait a while and pick up exactly initially what is coming out and encouraging it by coming out. I remember being taught that by, must have been a Jesuit there in Dublin who was teaching spiritual direction. He was giving techniques of pulling out. E.g., the person gets to the end of something, and if there's a pause, one can take up the last phrase that the person has said, and the person will go on. And then eventually one knows exactly the depth of the problem, having seen more or less the scenario. Then, the element of not being too wordy, lest we mistake where the problem is. That's important, but we need to have that natural inclination to invoke the Holy Spirit, give me the word. And the word can be another question. And we find that by asking the right question, there the real problem lies and comes out. So often a certain patience before speaking is a great help. But that too can be true of, in general, seeing what is going on here or there. Often the root cause is not the visible one. I hate pride and arrogance, says wisdom. Pride and arrogance. It's the case of false worship, where in some way we're hijacking a church setting so as to glorify ourselves. We're a DJ, a disc jockey, we're drawing attention to our brilliance. It's ruinous. But also with regard to attitudes with other people. Pride and arrogance are rude, invasive, heavy to bear. It's an illness of the soul, and of course has a profound root. Self-knowledge is normally natural healing of pride, because pride is based on illusion. One time, St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, the one who was given the veneration to the Sacred Heart, was moved to a slight movement of internal vainglory. And she was given, in a flash, a vision of her soul. And it was so ugly, compared with divine majesty and purity, that she was terrified. And it was a lesson to her forevermore that she did not know herself until she realized it was all given. Now, that too is the fundamental nature of our being, as the Lord himself taught Catherine of Siena. "Know, my daughter, you are she who is not, and I am he who is." That's our truth. All that we have received it, and often only on loan. So to appropriate it is to be participating in the fundamental sin of Satan, who owned his light, Lucifer. Illusion. And then that arrogance comes through in our attitude with God, when we are noisy in his presence, but also with people when we are noisy in their presence. Noisy in the sense of not having that delicacy to let them be. Letting a person express himself and be fully what he is. We control people and invade them. Now, I would just like to finish on one point. It is this. Humility, as Teresa of Avila taught, is only truth. But it goes both ways. It is a false humility to deny the gifts. And one saint, I forget who it was, said this, that she was suspect of protestations of humility. In other words, it can be pride in reverse. It can be a subtle form of pride. Humility also recognizes humbly it has received. But then it doesn't stop there, it deflects. There are ways and means of, in some way, steering well any praise that might come. But to refuse it is, in some form, a way of being proud again, because they're not actually praising ourselves if we realize it. There's a false humility, however, in the clerical life, which, as though the honor given to a priest will be given to his person. And then what he might do, he might strip himself of all the difference and refuse all difference, falsely thinking that that is coming to him, when in fact it's actually going in the direction of Christ present in him, which is two separate issues. And real humility is actually to defend the dignity of the priesthood. When one has no distinction whatsoever, one is in some way bringing down the whole priesthood. It's not our being, just our own being. And for instance, priests who want to be like everyone else, for instance in their conversation and their language, are doing harm to the priesthood. And it doesn't help evangelization sometimes when you hear people, I've even heard children actually, complain that a priest is swearing, and they're confused. And what's going on there? Now people, they need, without having that aloofness, that otherness which is unapproachable, they need a certain dignity. As in any profession, we have to be up to the level of our profession. And I've noticed actually, it's quite alarming that if one observes how some priests just wear clothes which are not at the level of their dignity. A doctor will wear a tie and so on. A priest often, he will go around in an open neck shirt. Now, these are things which one questions. The dignity of the priest is higher than that of the surgeon and professor, and yet he's not well dressed. If one opts not to wear a clerical collar, if one wears a cross or something, then there's no need to be in any way casual and in some way misdemeaning the grandeur of one's presence. One dresses well. I remember as a student, we sometimes had ecumenical celebrations, and you would have the different Protestant clergy there in front, it might be in a Protestant church, in the area where the clergy would be, in the front of the church, the chapel, dressed, not with a collar because they were Protestants, but they would have dignified clothing which they would wear on a Sunday for going into the pulpit, their own form of dignity. And then you might have the Catholic chaplain of the students. He might go in and he was very shoddily dressed, even there. I see, that's interesting. Getting so much into the mode of students as to be like them in everything, and then not realizing that actually socially it is not acceptable. So one has to be on the level of one's profession also as a human being. Dignity in one's bearing, it's a part of the defense of the sacred. We do not suddenly enter into a different mode when we come into church and on the altar and then divest oneself completely of that. There's a linear movement, a continuity. So that dignity of being alter Christus abides even until the moment of death. So I leave it with that. These things matter. Spirit and truth involves every element and dimension of our being at every moment of our existence.